Well, good afternoon, everybody. As you can see, we're doing something complicated today, so we hope that this one will work out. I'm sure it will. So thanks to all for being here, and I know a few more people will probably be arriving as they tend to do as these progress. This is actually an interesting conversation on teaching learning, a little different. We decided to do a panel discussion this time, and it really does pertain to how to engage students in very large classes. And many of you have, in the room have taught very large classes. You know how difficult it is to keep the students, especially toward the back, actually engaged in what's happening. And it's an age-old problem. It's not an ODU problem. It's a national, international problem. And we have a group here from China who are going to take some of these lessons home, I hope, and work with them. Our panel today is going to discuss some new methods that they've been trying and succeeding to a large extent with working with larger groups of students, larger classes. And we've got three very different disciplines here that have got involved in this truly multidisciplinary effort. Dr. Stephen Bergen, on my far left, who is Assistant Professor of STEM Education and Professional Studies in the College of Education. We've got Kristen Gregory, who's a Bergen College of Education student. Welcome. And we have Dr. Helen Crompton, Assistant Professor of Instructional Technology, also in the College of Education. And behind me is somebody who I know fairly well because I'm married to him. This is Dr. De Paor in the Department of Physics. He's a geophysicist who's been working on, and so as you can see, he's coming in by technology from another state. This group has had a FIG grant, which is a Faculty Innovator grant from the Office of Research, and sorry, I beg your pardon, from the Center for Learning and Teaching. That's not a research grant, it's from the Center for Learning and Teaching, in order to develop this technology that they'll be describing today. It's a mobile technology. This is a rare case when faculty tell their students that they must bring their mobile devices to class and they must have them on. And this is a little different from what a lot of our faculty do. So looking forward to an interesting conversation today. And I'm not sure who's starting, but okay. Apparently Helen is starting, so I'll hand over to Helen.
Thank you, and hello.
Hello.
Thank you, and thank you for attending this Provost conversation on how to facilitate student questioning in large classrooms. So, as the Provost said, my name is Helen Crompton, and I'm an Assistant Professor in Bergen College of Education. I teach classes, small classes, on how to incorporate technology effectively in K-12 settings. And my research is very much focused on mobile technologies, and especially the use of those in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
And I'm Stephen Bergen. I'm a science education faculty member. I predominantly teach our pre-service teachers, K-12, how to teach science more effectively. My research stems around the idea of authentic engagement in the practices of science and engineering, one of those being posing questions and the types of questions that are asked by working professionals in the STEM community, and how could we have students engage in other types of authentic practices. So that's my connection to the team.
Hopefully the technology is working. You can hear me. My name is Declan De Paor, Professor of Geophysics and Director of Planetarium. My research centers around geospatial visualization and using mobile devices for digital mapping in geology. And I'm on sabbatical, so I'm enjoying not teaching about 400 students this semester. I do have one record to declare. According to my best calculation, this will be approximately my 47,000th Provost conversation.
My name is Kristen Gregory. After 16 years of teaching in both elementary and community college classrooms, which were typically smaller, I am now the Faculty Professional Development Manager at the Batten Center for Teaching Excellence at Tidewater Community College. I am also a second-year doc student in the Teaching and Learning Curriculum Instruction Literacy Leadership Program.
Wonderful. So you might notice that we're all from different colleges, from different backgrounds, and I thought I'd better explain really how we all got together. So what happened was Dr. De Paor was doing his fabulous thing of teaching large classrooms very innovatively. He actually last year got the Teaching with Technology Award from ODU. And this drew the attention as well, all this that he was doing, of Stephen, Dr. Bergen, who is focused on science. And so he was looking at how Dr. De Paor was teaching, and he got involved with him that way. And last year I came to ODU and I heard about everything that Declan was doing again, Dr. De Paor, and I jumped on the mobile technology that he was using in his classroom. So I kind of joined in there. I'm there with my hands up going, yay, technology, when everything's good. And then we have two students there, graduate students in the bottom right, and that's Kristen Gregory and Relita Summers. And they joined in our team, our audacious team. What happened was we got a grant from the Centre of Learning and Teaching, a faculty innovator grant, to do the research on what Dr. De Paor was doing in his classroom, to look at how he was using technologies. And we were able to get the grant to get Kristen, who joined our team for a semester to help us do our work there. And Relita was obviously engaged and thinking, wow, they're doing something really innovative. I would like to volunteer. So it was wonderful to encourage her to come along and join our team and look at what was actually happening in the classroom. So that is how we all got together as a team. And we were doing research, but I do want to point out in this session that we are looking at research and how that actually affects practice, that hopefully you can take some things away with you today that you'll be able to use in your classroom, whether it be a large classroom or a small classroom.
All right, Declan, I think you're on.
I'm on. Okay. So I have to admit that my younger son, rather, Tian, and I are kind of geeks, and we're the type of people who lined up for 3 hours to get the first iPhone on the first day that it was released. And it immediately became clear to me that this device could be useful for engaging students in this very large class, intro astronomy class that I teach. And I had previously worked with flashcards, with clickers, hated those clickers, and but that kind of technology enabled the professor to send questions out to students, and I still use Learning Catalytics to fire out questions to students and questions that I think of. But I started in 2009 handing out my cell phone number to the class and telling them, I would walk around with my iPhone in my hand, and I told them, send me a text if you have a question. And so I got completely different types of questions in this way, a lot more interaction, and learned a lot of things about how students are thinking in class, especially, for example, that they're kind of 3 slides behind all the time. They're always thinking about something you said 5 minutes ago. And then when Glass came out, I got this device, this wearable computer, which allows me to read the text messages without actually the interruption of looking down at my phone. So it's more seamless.
So what we were hoping that you all would do is, I believe there's a phone number floating around, and that's actually Declan's phone number. Don't share it too widely, although we will say that he does share this with all of his students, and you can speak to that in a moment. But what we'd like throughout the presentation is, instead of asking us questions, you can do that at the end, but during the presentation, instead of asking us questions, text them to that number, and they'll show up on his Google Glasses, and or Google Glass, sorry, and he can actually read them and respond to your questions that you might have. So feel free to try it out. This is what Declan students, exactly what they've been doing the past few semesters. Declan, anything to add?
just sent me a message, and I've responded. I don't know if I can get it in front of my camera there, so do send a text.
All right. So we thought we'd start with a big overall view of the importance that we see of questioning. And so here are a number of questions that we would pose to you to be thinking about throughout our time. But why do we ask questions in class? And who's the one asking them? Should our students be asking questions, or should we be the only ones who pose the question? So this really goes back to what are the purposes of questioning. And I mentioned my interest in the practices of science. Questioning is a big one. So I'm convinced that we want our students to be posing thoughtful questions. I can come up with questions pretty easily. Do my students ask questions? Do they have the freedom to do this? Obviously, it might be challenging with 400 students, but I would suggest it's even hard in my own classes with 24 students to get them asking the types of questions that I want them to ask. So we're not going to ask you to respond to all these now, but we just thought they would be stimulating, thought-provoking, think about your own practice, the classes that you've taught, and the ways that you've facilitated student questioning. I must admit, this was a major shift in my thought when we started this project, was why does it even matter for students to ask questions? I knew, like I said, about the practices of asking a good research question or carrying out a project to completion in that way, but for the purposes of class period at a university campus like ours, how many questions do we want? And what types of questions should we be excited about when we receive? And how do we give students a voice? And so then we started delving into the literature around these issues, and hopefully that literature will speak for itself to a certain extent. But this is the backdrop of what we did and the suggestions that we're going to offer.
So the majority of my teaching experience has been in smaller classrooms at the community college level. And so we have used a variety of techniques in the classroom to get students involved and engaged. So the first one that we use the most is burning questions. And so as students are preparing for the class lecture or for the class session, they are preparing questions at home to bring into the class to help guide that instruction. The faculty member can then use those burning questions to design his or her lecture, but also to give the students some more control in what types of information is being covered over the course of the lecture. Roundtable discussions are also very effective in that students can break up into small groups and create questions with their group, or they could even have brought those questions in prior. Students are then held accountable to help each other answer the questions or to pull various resources that they're using in the class and through various types of media to answer each other's questions, but also they answer those basic level questions and start together to create some of those higher level questions, and the faculty member can come around and support as needed, but again, it's putting some of the power back in the hands of the students. Corners is a good activity to get students up and moving around the classroom. As they have prepared the questions, you can post them around the classroom, and then students in small groups will move from the flip charts around the corners and use their resources and each other to answer those questions and put their comments on the flip chart. And then after all the groups have moved across or around to each of the flip charts, you can come back together and see the comments that they have put on there, but also what further questions that have evolved from these discussions, and then the faculty member can supplement as needed. 10-2 is a strategy that a lot of our lecturers use. After teaching and instructing for roughly 10 minutes, take a little break and let the students work either individually or in small groups, kind of recap the information, but then to see what kind of questions there are. And that prevents students from making it the full hour and not having that chance to ask those questions or to get that clarification. 3-2-1 debrief is a good exit activity, but also can be used as you're transitioning between topics, where students, again, individually or in small groups, can pull out 3 of the main concepts that were discussed or taught during that lesson, come up with 2 examples or applications for that concept, and then 1 unresolved question. And then you could use that unresolved question for further discussion or further instruction from the faculty member. And then, of course, there's the old-fashioned raising of the hands, which is a little more common and feels a little easier as a student in one of the smaller classrooms.
Yeah, I would say with that one too, when I'm teaching a small class, my tendency is to do the age-old any questions, and then you don't get any, and then I think everybody understands and we can move on, and that's couldn't be further from the truth. And as much as I actively try to provide other ways for my students to pose questions, that's the, I guess, by nature default go-to thing to do that I'm still guilty of myself, and I've been catching myself since we've done this thing. Oh, all I do is any questions. I need to do other things than just that particular thing.
And another strategy also is to actually give wait time. In other words, ask the students if they have any questions, and rather than just saying, do you have any questions, and then moving straight on, give time for them to think and wait. And also give time to ask those questions. In fact, I'm going to move to Declan just for a minute now, just to see if there's any questions that the audience have been asking that you'd like to respond to.
Yeah, people have asked, they're starting to come in now, fast and furious. People asked, you know, am I peppered with the same question? Well, of course, if I see the same question, if I've already answered it, I'll ignore. Also, if I don't know the answer, I can always ignore. But someone asked, do students phone me all the time now that they've got my number? And it's almost never happened. A couple of students were lost on their way to night observation and called my cell phone number, but they've been warned in class, do not call outside of class time, and only text, no call. They're coming in too fast to answer here, but I thought maybe I could read out some of the questions from a recent, unless I'm over time, Helen.
No, you're good. You're good.
Yeah. Why are Mars's moons named Panic and Fear? Does Mercury have the greatest elliptical orbit of the terrestrial planets? If Venus has flat volcanoes like a pancake, can it also have concave volcanoes? How realistic is terraforming other planets? Why isn't Mercury tidally locked to the sun? You know, see, some of these are pretty high level. And then you get, any way we can ban food in class, the smells of onions here, and other things like that.
As Declan was talking, it reminded me, and this will come up later, but what we did was we collected all the questions like what he read out, and we started to qualitatively investigate them. We started coding them and categorizing them, and it prompted some really great debate, constructive debate between Helen and I about could a question that can be answered with one word, like some of the ones that Declan just read, are yes or no questions. My tendency was to say, well, those are super low-level questions because they didn't ask for anything other than yes or no. Then we started really digging into what they were asking and why they might not have worded it in a deep way. The nature of the question itself required theorizing and making connections and honestly asking really scientifically minded questions. They just might not have been grammatically structured in a way that I would have wanted because it's not open-ended, but it's still a deep question. So those were a lot of fun conversations that we ended up having as we poured through what questions is Declan getting.
So I'm just going to cover now transition from smaller classrooms that Kristen covered to large classrooms.
There's a question here for Kristen, which is, what do they do during the 2 of the 10-2?
During the 2, they can discuss the content that was just covered in the 10 and see what kind of questions that they have, if anything needed to be clarified, or if they wanted any extension information about the content that was in the 10.
So you see, that's great, because the person who asked that question was obviously too shy to raise his or her hand and ask directly, so they get their information. Okay,
Perfect. And good question, whoever it was that asked. Excellent question. Self-identified at the front here. Okay, so looking at lecture approach, it's not always positive, as in 50% rise in enrolment, and if you look at the figure on there, it was from 2004 that was reported, and I believe since then it's gone up. So there's a lot more students coming in, which is fantastic, but also at the same time we're running on limited resources and budget that can make things difficult, and classes can increase in size greatly. Quite often classes can double up for one instructor. So at the same time as well, the faculty accountability is also being raised, which is wonderful. As an educator, I'll say myself, for the fact that we do want educators to be accountable for what they're doing, and ensuring that the students are learning in the classrooms. So, but that's going to be a difficult situation when you've got loads of students in front of you, and you're having to ensure that you're providing them with good education to every single one, as if they were in a class that were, say, of 10, 20.
I would say also that Declan's classes lend themselves to this, because typically, I mean, this happens in many disciplines, but science, I would say, at the undergraduate level is one in particular that you end up with really large lectures of courses that people need to take early on before they move on to their various focused disciplines. So you think about your own experiences in a chemistry class or a biology class or an astronomy class. These are the ones that tend to be giant. And this is an age-old problem of, okay, how do we in a science class get students to ask questions and be comfortable doing so?
So if you yourself have been in a large classroom, you probably connect with many of these negatives in a way to large classrooms, in that the traditional style of teaching is a lecture style, because that is the easiest way to connect with as many people as possible in your class. That's the way people typically see it, so they give the lecture where there's very little interaction. And so students are passive surface level learners quite often in these situations, because they're hearing things and they have no way of connecting and doing anything themselves about what they're taking in. And again, that can be very much surface level learning in that they've heard it so they can memorize it, but are they really internalizing what they're getting if they're just getting the lecture style approach? And so that can have a negative effect in various ways on students. For example, there can be great drops in student retention when they go to large classrooms, also on completion of activities. If you imagine it, if you're in a small class, or if you're teaching a class of, say, 20 to 30, it's easy to monitor to make sure that they're all completing their assignments, yet in large classrooms, the students often can feel, oh, I'm anonymous, they won't notice perhaps if I don't give that in, and they don't invest themselves as much in the class. That can happen again if it's just very much a lecture style approach where there is that distance. Now, I'm not saying this is happening in Declan's class, because again, this is you're using a very different approach. Go ahead.
Can I just say something about the anonymity of sending text? Somebody asked, do I know the students' names? And I will obviously know if they sign their text or write their name, but otherwise I only see their phone number, and I don't remember 400 phone numbers. But one great advantage is if you're just relying on people holding up, raising their hands, then Mary Lou is sitting there beside Betty Sue, and she knows that her friend isn't asking this question because the hand has been raised by that clever chap who always asks questions in the front row. But with text, Mary Lou hears me say, you know, that's a great question I just received from somebody. It could be Betty Sue beside her who sent that question. You know, so they may feel, hey, maybe I should be asking.
And you also might think, well, okay, so we want the students questioning, so why don't they put their hand up? Why don't they get engaged? Why don't they put themselves out there? And that is, again, it can be the feeling of large classrooms that they feel isolated from others, which seems a bit of an oxymoron for the fact that there's so many people there, yet they can feel isolated. And there's also a decrease in motivation from that. Again, the focus of that I'm one student of so many. The research actually found that the majority of students that actually do put their hand up are white male students. And quite often other people leave it for those white male students to kind of ask the questions, which is sad again following on what typically happens. They worry about putting their hand up for two opposite reasons. They worry about appearing to be stupid. You know, why did you ask that question? That's obvious. Everybody got it. You know, why would you put your hand up for that?
It's just a typical example. I once was asked, what does nuance mean? And a student would never ask that question by raising their hand.
Yeah, the low surface level. But the problem is, if they don't ask those questions and they don't have that basic understanding, you can go a lot further down the line explaining something, but they won't have it because they won't have that basic understanding. And again, they won't put the hand up to ask those basic questions. On the other side, students struggle to put the hand up for the fact that they don't want to appear nerdy. You know, oh, they think they're intelligent, you know, that type. So it's easier, often they feel, just not to raise the hand. So the other one, this is a large one actually, is about the gap. And in fact, Declan's struggling because we're all talking and we're continuing, but he's struggling sometimes to get a gap in edgeways to mention things. And that is typical in classrooms, that the instructor giving a lecture could be just in the flow of what they're saying, and they don't want to put the hand up and stop them because they feel like it's interrupting and it's perhaps rude. So that's another negative that way. And instructors can also see that as a negative. That I was in the flow, I was explaining something, you know, don't ask me now, which is the negative side. Now, I've pointed out a lot of negatives there, but please think of it as a positive that we've seen that there can be a problem in large classrooms due to these issues, but there are solutions to this, and Declan's used many of those solutions because student questioning is so important. We've mentioned some earlier, Stephen's mentioned a few as well, but it helps promote active, autonomous learners. It was McKeechie that said, we understand that students learn when they come to university, but do we teach them how to think? And really, that's the core of education. We need to have students being self-learners, lifelong learners, and by having them actually think for themselves and think, oh, what do I want to know? How does that extend from what I know? That is a great way to help them do that. It also helps them take on that information and connect it with what they already know. Many students have the cognitive dissonance, in other words, where what the information we're getting might conflict a bit with what they have, so they try and work it out. And as well as doing that, asking questions is a great way to help solve that. And we've just got a few other examples up there, but there are many others, but it's things like extending understanding, understanding the content in different ways. They might see a different perspective and want to put that forward to be able to get an idea of how the educational concept is, you know, to help them understand a little bit further. And again, it provides motivation to learn because they're invested, because they've been given a chance to be active in their learning, so that helps with motivation. Now, how technology can support this process. It was Marx and Vygotsky that said that tools can be mediators of society and learning as well. And we can use tools. I can see many people in the audience using tools. It sounds like, Declan, you're probably getting a lot of questions there.
Slow down while you're talking.
I don't want to interrupt you, even virtually.
They don't even want to interrupt virtually. Do we have any questions, Declan?
Yes, one person asked, do I end up covering less material but in more depth? And really, I want to address that because it's important, because let's face it, we're addicted to lecturing. Even though, lecturing started when there weren't enough textbooks to go around, and then the professor read the book so that the monks could transcribe or whatever. Our textbooks are no longer connected to the bookshelf in monasteries with the students. And we do have this thing called the internet. So the students know everything. They have all of the content knowledge in their mobile device. So we really need to unhook ourselves from this need to lecture. So in my class, every student has a mobile device. I'm teaching with Learning Catalytics, which is a class management system. So I have a class map. I can hover over the class map and see the student's name, address 400 students by name. I speak for about 10 minutes, and then I fire out a question, and the computer introduces the students to their neighbors. So I'll ask them a question. Here I'm talking about what Pauli's rule, for example. I'll send a question out, and the computer says, Joe, talk to Delicia on your left and Tyrell on your right. So there's a lot, it's noisy, they're chatting, they're sending questions back to me, and I'm firing questions out to them. It's not lecturing in the traditional sense. So there's questions coming in about the comparison of the type of question I get on cell phone versus glass, and I know that Helen wants to address that coming up.
So I was just going to point out how technology can support the process. As Declan mentioned, a lot are connected, especially by the web, and if you think about it, they are protected. It's kind of like a wall behind which they can ask questions and do all sorts of things. So if you think about it that way, this technology can be used as a way for students to remain anonymous if they want, so they don't have to appear nerdy or stupid or anything like that. It provides that anonymity where they can just quick type or text questions to the instructor. And what's nice as well is the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, when they're sending the message to the instructor, they can choose when to respond to that question. So if they're in the flow of something, or if they're about to come up to it, they can hold and wait and think, okay, I'll answer that question when I've done this section. But it just works out nicely, rather than a student sometimes putting the hand up, because sometimes it can spoil the flow of what you're doing.
Which is exactly what just happened. I don't know if you picked up on that, but we have a slide coming up that answers directly the question of comparing Google Glass with text. And so Declan knew that, so he deferred it to, it'll be answered in due time.
And straight back to you, Declan.
Right, well, so a question came in about a flipped classroom. I sent a text out about the fact that my classroom is partially at least flipped, and the person wants to know what that means. So a flipped classroom, in the traditional classroom, you lecture and then you assign homework. The students go home and do the homework. In the flipped classroom, you put your lectures online or your PowerPoints on or PDF in Blackboard. The students read that outside of the classroom, and they do their homework in the classroom. So if you can go forward the slide, Helen. So in addition to sending out questions from the computer via Learning Catalytics, I will have think, pair, text in classroom. So instead of think, pair, share, they text their group response. We have what we call shut up and calculate, which stop philosophizing, and the students do calculations that's just like homework calculations right there in the middle of the lecture. One thing that I do is if I get a message that says, can you slow down or can you speed up, I don't respond to that, I just do it. Often students will say, can you go back a slide? So I don't say I even received the request, I just go back a slide. And I find myself looping back through the slides much more than I used to. It's changed the way I teach because students are constantly thinking about the second last slide, not about the one that you're talking about right now. Someone just asked, do students shop, do other work, or play on Facebook instead of texting? Well, you know, they're going to be doing that anyway, so at least part of the time they're texting me, which is better than nothing. But I have my 5 TAs walking around and tapping students on the shoulder if they're obviously on Facebook or whatever. The TAs attend the class and they engage the students in the flipped classroom exercises. So, like I say, I get questions that go back a slide, tell the person beside me to shut up, in addition to the intellectual questions. And then there's one type of question that you certainly will never hear from a student raising their hand. I've never heard. I was talking about the origin of the Earth, and a student obviously realized suddenly that my origin story was different to what their preacher would tell them, and they sent me a question, what about God and freedom of religion? And so I was able to address that, because this is a problem for some students in an astronomy class or geology class. You're telling them things that are challenging their belief systems, and so you have to be prepared to address those on the spot. Okay, Helen?
So Declan has discussed some of these, but one of Berlita and my roles in this study was to observe his class over the course of the spring semester and to conduct interviews with him as well as his TAs. So throughout those observations and interviews, there were 4 main characteristics that really jumped out to me from looking back through my notes and observations. First and foremost is his priority of being connected and setting up this whole sense of connectedness within the course. Not only Declan being connected to his students, but his students being connected to him, the TAs being connected to the students and back, but as well as having the students connected to each other. And he shared some examples of those through learning Catalytics and through the texting. But he has that expectation that not only technologically will they be connected, but also personally. And that moves on to the second bullet. I wasn't quite sure what to expect when I first sat down in a lecture hall with 400 students, as I went to a small undergraduate and graduate university prior to coming here. So I sat in thinking, great, I can just hide over here in the corner. Well, Declan gets off the stage and he walks around the classroom. He will come right up to the student who is sleeping and wake him up. He will point out to the students that he is there to have this conversation with them about astronomy. And so he has this very personal nature about him that immediately the students know that expectation from him, and I think it starts to reduce some of the anonymity. He also involves the students in his demonstrations, so whether he's pulling them up on the stage or he's doing it right at their seats, he's getting them involved on many different levels. Third is multimodal. He has used quite a few different modes within the classroom. On several occasions I would come in a little bit early and various music was playing very loudly from the speakers. Throughout his interactive lectures, he played videos, he pulled in personal pictures of his grandchildren, again, getting the students involved and seeing that connection to him. And finally, he really promoted student engagement. In fact, I had to catch myself several times. My mom was an astronomer, and so I found myself taking notes on Declan and transitioning to the astronomy concepts. And so I had to make sure to move myself back to take the notes that the team needed. But active learning is certainly promoted in this class. There is the clear expectation that he will be engaged and that his students should be engaged as well. And his classroom management techniques of moving around the classroom, of the TAs moving around the classroom, and really having that personal conversation really helped to promote that. So thank you for the opportunity, Declan.
You're making me blush here. Helen, the question came in asking me if I would name the product again in case people missed it. And the product is Learning Catalytics. It's a course management system devised by Eric Mazur of peer instruction fame at Harvard. It's now owned by Pearson. It's not free, but neither are other alternatives. But it costs about $12 per student per semester. So it's cheaper than Flickr.
All right, so I'm not going to read all this, and I'm not expecting you to read all this, but here's a graphic representation of what it looked like really quickly, what we were finding. So as Kristen just shared, we had a couple different sources of data. One of them was the text messages themselves, and well, they were all SMS text messaging. The difference was whether they were received on the cell phone or via Google Glass. And so we had a number of questions that we analyzed, and so you can see some percentages and stuff like that on here and some examples. But we took a classification scheme and modified it and looked at, okay, how would we classify these questions? And we went from questions that didn't make any sense to us to questions that were the student giving information to Declan. So they weren't really questions, but it was a text saying some of the examples he shared. So-and-so is being distracting is something he might receive, which isn't a question, it's giving information to him. There were questions about the organization of the class. When is the homework assignment due type of a question. So we included them in our analysis. But for me, the more interesting things were this definition through theorizing. And so they're kind of in a continuum of similar to Bloom's taxonomy of higher order questions being ones that get to the point of making connections between things or theorizing about something versus just asking, well, what's the definition of this? And again, it was more complicated than just, like I said earlier, a simple yes or no response didn't automatically make it a question about a definition. So you can see that we had more questions from the text messaging than we did from the Google Glass, as it was a newer technology that hadn't been used for as many class periods. We didn't have as much data on it yet. So we are hoping to extend this. But overall, we didn't see dramatic differences in the percentages. You could see that perhaps there were some higher order, deeper questions, certain small percentages of increase when he went to Google Glass, and some decrease in the number of lower level questions, but they're slight, and we didn't do any quantitative analysis of this. This is purely descriptive information. So what we then did was analyze the interviews that the graduate students conducted with Declan and with the teaching assistants. And we asked questions like that. What's your perception of the difference between pre-text messaging and then also the text messaging received through your phone or through Google Glass? And some things that have already been raised are that with the text messaging, the questions were behind by the time the information got to Declan. Have to look at the phone. And so they're a few slides back. And the general perception of the use of the Google Glass was that it allows them to be in real time, closer to the activity at hand at that point in the lecture, which definitely of benefit. Yeah, Declan.
There may, I don't know, we haven't discussed this, there may be what they call a Hawthorne effect. This the effect that productivity of workers increases whenever you make any change. And even if you paint the walls, the productivity increases, and then you go back to the previous color and the productivity increases. So there may be just a novelty effect.
Yeah, so I mean, that's kind of cool to know. I mean, maybe that's why you're all texting Declan right now, because it's a novel technology. He's able to read it by looking at this place on his in his view through the Google Glass. Another thing.
Just add, Stephen, that normally I would speak my response, but I have to text back here in order to not interrupt all the time. That's why I'm on my phone all the time.
Oh, okay. So a couple other interesting things that have already been brought up, but that our data pointed to through the perceptions of Declan and the TAs are that students are asking questions not only of a higher level, but also asking questions that might be low-level questions that wouldn't be asked due to the anonymity, which is a good thing. My tendency in all this is to say, oh, I only want theorizing questions. And if we had nothing but theorizing questions, then the technology would be working to perfection. But I have to remind myself that there are value in all those other questions, including the information to the professor type questions that are valuable in the context of this course. So the TAs and Declan noted that as well. So some cautions in all of this is that we had a low number of questions. We haven't been doing this very long. We're not saying that all of a sudden magically this worked. We also have to remember that there were 400 students or so in the class. And so we didn't look at really what's a desirable number of questions in a given period of time with that many students. So the general perception is that there were more questions being asked since Declan started receiving the text messages. But could there be more? Probably. Should there be more? We don't know. So that's a caution. We're not really making that claim. But we also didn't analyze the frequency of the questions by student. So while there were more questions, we didn't really look at, okay, well, is it the same person texting over and over and over and over again? So there's definitely future studies and investigations to look at. Once Declan graces us with his presence on campus again, and we can go back in his classroom and do more of this. But we are finding some interesting things that are adding to the conversation about the use of these technologies to foster and promote student questioning.
Helen, a question has come in. Will the research also ask students their reflections on the experience instead of just interviewing faculty and TAs?
Yes, pending IRB approval. Yes, we hoped, I would really want to do that. We didn't for this study, but I think that is an excellent question to ask. And no, we did not talk to the students about their perceptions.
But the students do fill in their student evaluations at the end, and they frequently comment on the texting in a positive way.
Okay, I'm going to now take this back to have you thinking about what happens in your own classrooms and how this can perhaps be taken to your own classrooms. Now, many of you may be happy giving out your cell phone number to students in the class. Many of you may say that's definitely not going to happen. There's other ways to do this as well, such as back channels. Now, a back channel is a synchronous discussion. So it's typically held where the presenter, whoever it is speaking, and there's kind of like a back conversation going on without disturbing the rest of the group, but between people virtually in the audience. Now, one way to do that is, well, in fact, I've got about 3 different ways up there. Today's Meet, Campfire, and Back Channel Chat. These are just 3. There's multiple others as well, but these are 3 ways, 3 back channel programs that you can use, and these are all free. So I'm going to jump to Today's Meet, just so you can see what it looks like. So basically what happens is you give the student a number, and that's connected to, or it could be on a web address, and that's connected to this specific little chat kind of room. And so what happens is they type their name in, and then if you can see the blue box, that's where they put the message in. It might be a question, it might be a comment, it's whatever the students want to give. And then what happens is it appears in the thread down the other side. Now it can be worked in two ways. This could be viewable to everybody. In that way, questions asked by students could be responded to by the peers. That could be a good way to work. A negative of it appearing here is you can get students making funny comments. So you've obviously got to be aware that that can happen. But the other way it can happen as well is through having a laptop open so you can see this, and only you can see this personally that way, and having the students comment. So there's other ways to do it that are free as well.
Helen?
Yes, go ahead.
A question came in. Can you go back a slide so somebody can get the names of the other programs?
Yes, and it's Today's Meet, Campfire, and Back Channel Chat. Today's Meet I've used quite often, and that's a very good tool. And there's ways to, if you get to somebody, and it'll come up with their name after, if you get somebody that's actually making inappropriate comments, you can actually stop them from going into the chat. So there are educator safeguards there that you can put in place if you need them. And I'm going to pass you over to Stephen, and we'll just have a few minutes then at the end for questions.
Yeah, so we don't have to talk about these questions, but we can if we want to. Now's the point where we're going to turn over to you for the remaining few minutes. We went a little bit longer than we probably should have. Allison has a microphone, so you can now direct questions at us rather than Declan. But still, you could ask Declan as well. But here are some couple burning questions that I have. Why are we so hesitant to turn over questioning and to turn over control, or are we? Is this really that much harder in a smaller class than it is in a large class? I'll probably never teach 400 students at once. I wish there were 400 people wanting to be high school science teachers. That would be a wonderful problem to have. But it isn't one that is ever going to happen. So why is it still hard in my small class to get students to have a voice? One other thing that I'd like to throw out there that I'm still struggling with is when I ask a question and do wait time and let students think and process and respond, then sometimes I think they're taking more ownership than if they're asking questions that I am ready to answer right away because they view me as the authoritative figure. And so another thing about all of this is that I wonder, and I don't know the answer, is does promoting questions to an overextent get to the point where the students aren't taking ownership of solving the problem and answering the question for themselves? Just throw that out there for discussion as well. So that's it from me.
Typical of any class, small or large, one person in the audience has been asking me, where I met my spouse. Did I meet her in South Africa? Paying absolutely no attention. And we've been having a little chat on the side there, texting each other.
I think the first question, I'm going to give an answer rather than a question, then I'll ask a question. Instructors are reluctant, as far as I can understand, because it's unstructured. It's a loss of control. And they're insecure about doing it. We all are to some extent. We lose something in the process, in the linear process, by asking a question. So you got to get over that. What about the idea of calling on everybody? Not 400, but I use that technique when people aren't talking. Okay, everybody raise a question or give your answer. And then writing before asking a question is another possibility, I think. Ask people for a minute paper, and so that the non-questioners, the non-talkers, have an opportunity to think ahead on what they're going to ask, rather than the speedy people in 10 seconds. I had a second question that was really a question, but I've forgotten.
But yeah, something like a question jar that students are filling up with their written questions that could still be anonymous if they're not putting their names on it, and you could periodically answer those questions would be a strategy for a small class that could work well.
this is just a comment. You can actually get, I don't know if it's through Google, but you can get another number for free that you could give your students. You don't have to give your students your phone number. There's ways of getting other numbers for free online that you could give to your students, so you can cut it off whenever you want to.
And Helen, some of these resources that you shared earlier too, correct me if I'm wrong, but you could send in your answers via your cell phone or your mobile device as well, and so you're in essence doing the same thing without using your personal cell phone.
There's many others like Poll Everywhere, which is a great one, but the ones I was sharing were more student focusing, students initiating that conversation. Many others like Poll Everywhere kind of teacher initiated questions and that they respond to. But they are free as well that you can get. Okay, we're going to wrap it up now. Thank you very, very much for attending this session. If you've got any more questions afterwards, we'll be around for a while. But thank you much for coming.